Tuesday, Oman's foreign minister posted something hopeful. After a day of what he called constructive talks in Tehran, Badr al-Busaidi said he was hopeful the two countries would soon announce a temporary corridor through the Strait of Hormuz and practical arrangements to restore safe navigation. Wednesday, Iran's own Revolutionary Guard said something very different. In a statement, a spokesperson declared that the entirety of the strait, including Omani waters, is under Iran's military control and would remain so until the United States meets its commitments. On Thursday this morning, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre reported a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz had been hit by an unknown projectile, catching fire before the flames were put out. 3 days. 3 completely different stories about the same 8-mile stretch of water. So tonight, I want to walk through what actually happened this week, why a country can sign a transit agreement and insist, in the same breath, that the waterway is still closed, and what that contradiction tells you about who's actually setting the terms of this war 6 months in. Here's where things stand. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas trade in ordinary times. Since this war began in February, it's been effectively shut down, squeezed between an Iranian blockade and a U.S. naval response. In June, the U.S. and Iran signed what's known as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, brokered by Pakistan, outlining a regional ceasefire, a sanctions relief track, and a path to reopening the strait. Iran struck commercial ships in the strait in mid-July anyway, triggering U.S. retaliation and effectively killing that agreement. Since then, Iran and Oman have spent more than a month in direct talks, trying to build a narrower, temporary framework, one that doesn't require Washington's direct sign-off for governing the waterway. This week, that effort reached what looked like a breakthrough. And within 24 hours, Iran's own government was actively working to make sure nobody called it one. Let's walk through exactly what was agreed to, because the details matter more than the headline. Under the framework Iran and Oman have worked out, a temporary transit corridor roughly 7 miles wide would open through the strait. Inbound traffic, ships heading into the Persian Gulf, would pass entirely through Iranian territorial waters. Outbound traffic, ships leaving the Gulf, would pass partly through Iranian waters and partly through Oman's. The two countries also agreed to begin technical negotiations over the next 30 to 60 days on a more permanent arrangement, and reportedly discussed a minesweeping component to clear the strait of any remaining hazards. That's a real, specific, negotiated framework. It's also, according to Iran's own Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi, not a reopening. Speaking Wednesday, he said plainly that the strait is closed and that Iran has complete control over it. He said activating the proposed corridor would actually require closing the traditional southern passage first, and that Tehran and Muscat had only agreed to begin negotiating an alternative route, not to restore normal shipping. At the same time, the Trump administration has its own objection buried in the story. According to Fortune's reporting, Washington told Oman directly that it opposed parts of the emerging deal, specifically the idea of joint Iranian and Omani management of the outbound route. That's not a minor technical disagreement. That's the United States pushing back on the exact mechanism Iran and Oman have already reportedly agreed to. So how much shipping is actually moving through the strait right now? This is where the paper agreement and the physical reality pull furthest apart. According to Kepler's shipping data, only 5 commodity vessels passed through the strait on Tuesday. The same day Oman's foreign minister was publicly hopeful about a breakthrough. CNBC reported that overall strait traffic has fallen by 2/3 from its 10-day average, even as the talks were being described as close to a deal. And this morning, UKMTO confirmed a tanker was hit by an unknown projectile inside the strait, catching fire before it was extinguished. No casualties, no environmental damage reported, but a live attack on a commercial vessel, happening in the same week the corridor was being announced as a diplomatic win. Now hold all of that next to what Trump himself has been telling the public. In a radio interview with Glenn Beck this week, he insisted the strait is already open. He said, in his words, "We take a lot of ships through the strait now. We're taking them in. Every once in a while there'll be a drone or a rocket or something shot, but it is a very functioning strait. A lot of oil is pouring out." He also claimed that all mines in international waters in the strait have been removed or detonated, and warned Iran against laying any new ones. Iran disputes that mine clearing claim directly. And 5 vessels a day, down 2/3 from the recent average, with a tanker actively catching fire from an unidentified projectile the same week, isn't the picture of a very functioning strait. It's the picture of a waterway 3 different parties are describing in 3 incompatible ways, all at once. Let's break down why Iran is drawing such a sharp legal and rhetorical line between a corridor exists and the strait is open. Layer 1. Control, not access, is the actual issue. Under international maritime law, countries generally can't charge tolls for passage through international straits, like Hormuz, but coastal states can charge for services, things like navigational assistance, pilotage, and environmental protection. Iran has reportedly signaled it intends to introduce exactly that kind of fee system for ships transiting the corridor. That only works financially and politically if Iran can credibly claim it still controls the waterway, rather than conceding that the strait has simply reopened to normal international traffic on its own terms. Layer 2. This is a legal shield against the U.S., not against shipping companies. By insisting the corridor is a narrow Iranian-controlled exception rather than a genuine reopening, Tehran preserves its position that Washington has not met the terms of the original Islamabad memorandum. The IRGC statement made that explicit, tying the strait's status directly to U.S. compliance with that June agreement, not to whether ships are physically able to move through the water. Layer 3. Washington's objection to the Oman deal reveals its own version of the same instinct. The Trump administration isn't objecting because ships aren't moving. It's objecting specifically to the idea of joint Iranian-Omani management of the exit route, meaning it wants the corridor's oversight structured in a way that doesn't hand Iran shared, formalized control over how ships leave the Gulf. Both sides, in other words, are far more focused on who governs the strait than on how many ships are actually passing through it. Here's where this gets harder to spin as progress. Because the operational reality on the water isn't cooperating with either side's messaging, a tanker was hit by an unidentified projectile in the strait this morning. The same week, both governments were describing a breakthrough. UKMTO's alert didn't attribute the attack to anyone, which itself tells you something. Nobody has claimed responsibility, which means nobody currently has an incentive to be publicly associated with an attack happening in the middle of delicate negotiations. And that ambiguity is its own kind of instability. Traffic collapsing by 2/3 in the same window the deal was being announced is the more telling data point. Shipping companies aren't reading Oman's optimistic statement or Iran's disputed claim of control. They're reading risk, and right now, that risk assessment says stay out, corridor announcement, or not. A framework that exists on paper but hasn't yet moved the actual insurance and shipping industry risk calculus isn't functioning the way a genuine reopening would. And there's a broader pattern worth naming. This is not the first time Iran and Oman have announced progress on Hormuz. Talks between the two countries go back to April. Iran has previously claimed the strait was open, while barring U.S. and Israeli-linked vessels specifically, only for hundreds of ships, including many Indian vessels, to remain stranded at the time. The pattern of announced progress followed by continued practical closure isn't new this week. It's the shape this particular negotiation has taken for months. I want to give the strongest version of the optimistic read, because there's real substance behind it too. This is, on paper, the most specific and detailed framework the two countries have produced yet. A defined 7-mile corridor, a specific division of inbound and outbound routes between Iranian and Omani waters, an agreed 30 to 60-day window for follow-up technical talks, a mine-sweeping component. That's meaningfully more concrete than earlier rounds of talks that produced vague statements about possible options and visions and proposals. H. Trump himself insists ships are already moving through in real volume, and Treasury's own sanctions pressure campaign is explicitly designed to make reopening the strait economically necessary for Iran, giving Tehran a real incentive to see this framework succeed rather than collapse. If both sides have genuine financial reasons to want traffic flowing again, the disagreement over legal characterization, corridor versus reopening, might just be face-saving language layered on top of a deal that's actually working on the ground. That's a coherent case. Let's take it apart. Layer 1. The shipping data doesn't support already working. Trump's claim that a lot of oil is pouring out doesn't match Kapler's own tracking, which shows 5 vessels on the day in question and a 2/3 drop from the recent average. If the corridor were functioning the way Trump described it, that volume should be climbing, not collapsing, in the exact week the deal was publicized. Layer 2. Iran's insistence on closed isn't just face-saving, it's operationally consequential. Garbabadi didn't simply use softer language while ships moved normally. He said activating the corridor would require closing the traditional southern passage first. That's a structural precondition, not a rhetorical flourish. It means the corridor, even once active, functions as a narrower, more controlled substitute for normal shipping, not in addition to it. Layer 3. Washington and Tehran are still negotiating over control, not just semantics. The U.S. objection to joint Iranian-Omani management of the exit route is a substantive, unresolved dispute over who actually governs a critical piece of global shipping infrastructure. That's not a disagreement that gets solved by both sides agreeing to call the same thing by different names. It's a disagreement that has to be resolved before any framework can function at real volume, which is exactly why the current arrangement is still described as temporary and partial. Layer 4. An unclaimed attack in the middle of a breakthrough week undercuts the whole premise. If this framework represented genuine, stabilizing progress, the immediate practical effect should be a safer, more predictable strait. Instead, a tanker caught fire from an unidentified projectile in the same week the corridor was announced. Nobody knows yet whether that was an Iranian faction signaling disapproval, a third party testing the new arrangement, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, it happened inside the supposed breakthrough, not before it. So what does this actually mean going forward? First, shipping companies and insurers are the real referendum on whether this deal means anything, not government statements. If war risk insurance premiums for Hormuz transits start coming down in the next few weeks, that's a genuine signal the corridor is functioning. If they stay elevated or climb further after this morning's attack, that tells you the market doesn't believe the framework yet, regardless of what Oman, Iran, or Washington are saying publicly. Second, the U.S. objection to joint Iranian-Omani control is likely to keep resurfacing. Until that specific disagreement is resolved, any framework built on top of it remains provisional by design, vulnerable to being reopened, reinterpreted, or quietly stalled the moment either side wants leverage back. Third, Iran's insistence on maintaining legal and rhetorical control over the strait, even while negotiating a corridor through it, tells you the underlying dispute was never really about shipping logistics. It's about who gets to say the war ended on whose terms. A corridor that exists without an agreed answer to that question is a temporary patch, not a resolution. Here's what to track in the coming days and weeks. Signal 1. Watch daily vessel counts through the strait, not government statements about it. Kepler and similar tracking services publish this data regularly. If traffic climbs meaningfully above 5 vessels a day in the coming week, that's real movement. If it stays flat or falls further, the corridor exists mostly on paper. Signal 2. Watch whether anyone claims responsibility for this morning's tanker attack. An unclaimed strike leaves open several very different explanations, and which one turns out to be true will shape how seriously this corridor deal should be taken going forward. Signal 3. Watch the 30 to 60-day technical talks window Iran and Oman agreed to. If that process produces a defined permanent framework on schedule, that's evidence of real momentum. If it slips or gets overtaken by a new crisis before it concludes, that tells you the current corridor was always a stopgap. Signal 4. Watch whether Washington's specific objection to joint Iranian-Omani management of the exit route gets resolved, dropped, or escalated. That single unresolved dispute is arguably the most concrete obstacle standing between a temporary corridor and something closer to a genuine reopening. Signal 5, and this is the one to sit with the longest. Watch how each side keeps talking about this deal publicly over the next week. If Iran keeps insisting the strait is closed while traffic quietly increases anyway, that tells you the rhetoric and the reality have simply decoupled, each side performing a version of events for its own domestic audience. If the rhetoric and the shipping data start to align in either direction, that alignment is the real story, more than any single announcement. So here's where that leaves us. Oman's foreign minister called the talks constructive and said he was hopeful. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said the entire strait, including Omani waters, remains under its military control. Iran's deputy foreign minister said the strait is closed in plain language. The same week, his own government finalized a transit framework with Oman. Washington objected to part of that same framework. And this morning, a tanker caught fire from an unidentified projectile in the middle of all of it. None of that tells you this war is escalating tonight, and none of it tells you it's ending either. What it tells you is that 6 months in, the two sides can't even agree on the basic factual question of whether a stretch of international water is open or closed, let alone on how the war itself ends. A corridor got announced this week. Whether it actually becomes a reopening or just the newest version of a closed strait wearing a more optimistic name is still being written, one unclaimed tanker fire at a time.